Good evening, everybody. I'm going to talk this evening, not about him, about what makes great ideas. And it's something that if you're a creative person or you live by creativity and you're making ideas or you're judging ideas, you have to kind of decide at what point in time you think makes great ideas. And I was asked this question and I sort of went, well, it's what I like, really, which I thought was a very oversimplified answer to that question. But then I stood back and I started to question what it was I liked about ideas, what made them resonate for me. And I realized, if we move on to my next slide, it was this simple thing, irreverence. I loved irreverence in the ideas that I admired, in the work that I was creating. That's what I really sought. I loved the idea of irreverence. But then I thought to myself, well, let's investigate this a little bit more. Let's kind of, why is this the case? And I was fortunate enough to go to art school, and at art school we did art history, obviously, and delved back into the world of art. And I suddenly realized, of course, that from about the Renaissance on, if we start from the Renaissance, art wasn't about being irreverent. It was about reverence. And if we go to my next slide, because art was in the hands of authority. It was either a ruler who dictated what the artist should paint, or perhaps, my next slide, it was in the hands of the church, who would decide that belief was fundamentally important. You have to have faith in the church. And so they dictated, in a sense, what artists would or wouldn't paint. If you go on, and their interpretation of those stories was fundamentally important. And I just thought as an aside, it's all right, you can go on to the next one, that artists of those times actually were in many ways like people in advertising today. We all know the story, but you've got to give it a new twist. So their task was to explain the crucifixion, explain the Annunciation, or whatever it may be, but make people believe in it again. But essentially, it was about irreverence, if you go to my next slide. And of course, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel was a wonderful example of reverence. Believe in this. Believe in what the church is about, the power of the church. And this was formidable, this power that they actually had. If you go on to my next slide, I always think, you can't see it very well actually, but this is God handing power down to man. And in that painting, I'm not sure that Michelangelo intended God to be wearing a pink negligee. But in fact, what happened is, after he'd painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling, popes later decided there was far too much nudity, and they got an artist called Daniel da Vitero to paint over and put some wispy bits and a negligee on God. So I suppose nudity was a bit of an irreverence at that time. But it came about in a sort of rather strange and odd way. But actually then, of course, things began to change. And art changed, society changed. And as wealth grew, as choice grew, as we began to question, so in a sense, artists began to question. And they released themselves from the kind of shackles of their masters, so to speak, and they could appeal directly to the public. And I think it was, if you go on to the next slide, I think it was Turner, who was one of the first artists to sell his work directly to the public, which was a great way of cutting out the middleman. A bit like the supermarkets now, constantly trying to cut out the middleman. But Turner was a wonderful example of that, because Turner realized that if he didn't have a patron, he could paint what he liked, and he can express himself. And why this is therefore important, and that choice came into society, and choice was something that people sought, we suddenly realize now, if you go to the next slide, we live in a world of choice today. Unbelievable quantity of choice. Choices you've never seen it before. If you go on to my next slide. You know, I mean, just buying a simple pair of trainers becomes a kind of really difficult process, doesn't it? It becomes something actually quite hard. Which one do I go for? And of course, what this is about is about individuality has increased within society, and within that individuality, obviously, we have a decision to make about what we believe in, what we like, what we want, and it becomes about me rather than about us. And that's, I suppose you can argue, the downside of choice and the downside of freedom. But this was very important, and if you go to my next slide, I mean, artists now were taking over and were beginning to question the very basis of society, the way it operated, the way it worked. And the Dadaists came out of, probably as we all know, the First World War, and they revolted against the sort of terrible destruction and carnage that was wreaked upon mankind with their intolerance and their attitudes. And of course they wanted to mock establishment. And so if you go, so you know, painting a moustache on the Mona Lisa was a way of putting their two fingers up to authority and laughing at what they were doing. But this was, what's important about this, and what I think is interesting about this is, in a way, when you look at it, how irreverence begins to infect creativity and how it stimulates what we do. So if you go, the Bauhaus was a phenomenal art movement, phenomenal period of discovery, but essentially taking industrial materials and saying we can make domestic furniture with it was actually quite a revolutionary breakthrough. It was something that people hadn't realized before. And if you go on to my next slide, and not only did it affect this idea of industrial materials, but the idea of the factory and the home as a sort of place you worked in, and it was a factory and it had to be made to work. It infected typography and it affected the way communication worked. So one sees that this irreverence was really empowering the creative process. It was a seed within it which kind of gave it an energy which was quite incredible. So if you go to my next slide, and of course it not only empowered things like furniture, and it not only empowered art, but also obviously music. And as we all know, jazz was the voice of oppressed people. It was their way of expressing what they really felt, and it did so in a way which was quite alien to white people at that time, and it was a powerful statement of their individuality and their personality. And the blues and everything that came from that was in a similar vein, expressing individuality and challenging the way things were. And of course, out of all of that came my next slide, rock and roll, which was in itself an incredibly irreverent form of music, challenging, questioning, expressing music in a way which hadn't been heard before. So again, empowering, driving creativity forward. Go to my next slide. And I think one of the great icons of the industrial age, the motor age, is the Mini. The Mini was an incredible piece of design. Isigonis's design came about because he had to solve the conundrum of how do I make a small car big. That was the big problem that he had to solve. And he did it by a very simple way. He turned the engine sideways and he made the inside bigger, and therefore made a small car that was big on the inside. This was irreverent. I mean, nobody had done that before. Nobody had sort of said, oh, it's dead simple what you do, just turn the engine sideways. So he created a product which changed the way motor cars could be designed. If you go on. Architecture, the same thing. The great Falling Water House was a wonderful example of architecture where, you know, instead of building the house by the side of the river, Frank Lloyd Wright put it over the river, and the river ran through the house. And the same, of course, his next slide, the Guggenheim Museum in New York. I mean, making a museum that was going to show paintings that were essentially flat round and occupying the space in a completely different way was a very irreverent piece of design. And it stood out as a sort of a statement of creativity. Before you've walked into the building, you're thinking about creativity, you're thinking about difference. Continue. And the same, of course, with Geary's Bilbao Guggenheim. The same thing. an irreverent piece of design that captured people's imagination, challenged the way we think about a building. So consequently, as you walk in, you're thinking creativity. But, and I think this is the moment I have to say but, there is a problem with irreverence. I think if you think about the punk movement was the ultimate irreverent moment of time in the last sort of 30, 40 years. But the problem with the punks is that they just opposed. Go on to my next slide. They didn't, in fact, and the danger of irreverence is if you just oppose and you don't propose, then you fall into a kind of chasm and you just become a kind of a meaningless statement. And in the sense of, next slide, sense of punk, it was just ultimately about fashion. It was about destruction. It was not about construction. It was not putting anything else in its place. So in my view, if you go to the next slide, you know, the whole pop art movement for me was a very irreverent movement, a fantastic movement. Next slide. But it was about looking at fame, it was looking at everyday objects, it was looking at what is famous now, what is relevant, what should we be considering. It had a positivity to it. Yes, it challenged. I think Warhol, if you take the next slide, you know, Warhol's electric chair made us think about what we were doing. It took an electric chair and said, you know, consider this as a piece of art, consider what it's doing, and really, really began to challenge our preconceptions. So I think really powered his art, but also made us think. In other words, it opposed something and it proposed something. My next slide. Now, for those in advertising, some of you obviously will know, but some of you might remember this campaign for Benetton, United Colours of Benetton, where they showed a man dying of AIDS. And if you go to the next one, it showed this baby. Now, the problem is you can argue that that was very irreverent, showing a picture like this, surely shocking. And the problem with it is that actually it is just destructive. It doesn't propose anything. It exploits our emotions. And although you're going to be irreverent, you've got to absolutely propose. I think it was Ruskin who said there is no beauty without truth. In the end, whatever you do, it has to have truth as its foundation. And this campaign in particular failed because it never embraced the audience. It challenged us, but actually it left us feeling hollow, so therefore it doesn't work. So if you go to my next slide. So, you know, if I write the word crap, or an even worse word if you want to think about it, yes, you can be offended by it, but of course, if I write it like this, next slide, I change the meaning. I put perhaps a sense of wit, a sense of charm into it, and you might smile and you might think about it. Now, that's not a profound thought, I know that. But the important point here is that if you're going to be irreverent, how do you take people with you? I'm challenging you. How do I bring you with me? And of course, the great way we do that, and the great way communication does that in lots and lots of different ways, is it uses humour. And humour is one of the most powerful forces we have. And as we know, humour is the enemy of authority. And if I use wit, if I use humour, I can be really quite provocatively irreverent, and I can carry my audience. I can take you with me. So, and at this point, actually, because of technology, I was going to show you a bit of film, but we're not going to do that. And this is essentially where I sort of end. Humour is the enemy of authority. But I think the important thing for me, the thing I'd like to sum up and say is, it really, really powers creativity. It powers creative thought. But more than that, but much more than that, it also powers organizations. It empowers institutions. Organizations, institutions that embrace irreverence, that challenge, that question, are organizations that really do have a future because they're constantly asking the question why. They're constantly challenging. So for me, irreverence is this fantastic force, this force which energizes creativity, energizes my ideas, challenges me all the time, challenges me to move forward, And of course, in our industry, not only am I trying to propose that you should buy this product versus another one, but I'm constantly trying to remind you that it's better than its competitors. So irreverence drives my creativity and the power of the thoughts that I have. So thank you very much. That's the power of irreverence.